Hi, I'm Rolf Smedvig, and welcome to Learning from the Legends. The key to playing the first movement of the Haydn musically is to understand the contrast between the lyrical sections and the more rhythmic fanfare sections. Throughout this movement, you hear this fanfare motif. The rest of the movement is very melodic and lyrical, so you want to focus on playing with a smooth, warm sound all of the time. It should never be forced. Even in the big technical areas, the tendency is to force the notes, which just makes it sound awkward. You should keep in mind throughout this movement that you're playing the first piece ever written for the chromatic trumpet. Before this instrument and this concerto, all of these fanfares would have probably been on single notes, which would have been much less melodic. Even the opening notes of this movement would not have been possible because of their low range. Hopefully, keeping this in the back of your mind will help you gain an even greater appreciation for this piece while you're studying it. Finally, Haydn doesn't call for a lot of vibrato. If you have a natural vibrato in your tone, that's fine. But don't go out of your way to add vibrato. Before you play your first notes, there are 36 measures of introduction by the accompaniment. In my edition, I've added some fanfares starting at measure 12 to enhance the arrangement. This is actually pretty common in performance, but this is optional, so feel free to leave it out if you want. If you practice and work hard, you might have the opportunity someday to play this with full symphony orchestra. However, it's far more likely that you will be playing this with a piano accompaniment. There are many great pianists out there that can play these challenging orchestral reductions, but sometimes you might be playing with a piano player who is new to this kind of music. If that's the case, then the most important thing to stress is that the eighth note rhythms are the key to the pulse of this piece. Right from the beginning, the second bar has a tendency to slow down. No matter how much you practice, you can't change the tempo of this music if your pianist slows down. This means you have to learn an important skill in how to communicate to your accompanist to make sure that they don't slow down and really pound out the eighth note bass line in bars 3 through 6. If those measures don't slow down, then tempo is probably not going to be a big issue. Before we begin, I want you to remember one more very important fact about your performance. It begins the second you walk out on stage and ends when you can no longer see your audience. Always try to keep eye contact with your audience at all times. As a performer, it's your job to carry your listener. Grab your audience from the moment you walk on the stage and hold them until you walk off. So with that, let's take a listen to your first section of this movement. Then we'll go back and break it down measure by measure. opening theme has to be full and big. There's nothing tricky here melodically. Just practice your E-flat major scale. You should get in the habit of bringing your instrument up and getting your mouthpiece set on your lips one measure before your entrance. Breathe once you're set. Then focus and play your first phrase. It's important to play measure 38 exactly in tempo. The eighth notes are articulated, but never play short and pecky. Keep the notes long. In the next measure, you want to play the eighth notes with the first two slurred and the second two tongued. The tongued notes should almost sound like a slur. Just gently emphasize the fourth beat with a light tongue. In measure 40, the accompaniment answers your phrase by repeating the eighth notes you just played. Then you answer right back with the same melody for your next entrance. This back and forth or call and response with the accompaniment happens throughout this entire movement, so it's important to understand how you fit together. When you get to the 16th notes in measure 42, there's no accompaniment playing with you. The repeated eighth note melody in the last three measures was all leading up to this little solo moment. But I like to play this almost more gentle. I really want to make it sound effortless. You've got a long way to go in this piece, so there's no point in peaking right here at the beginning. Because the 16th notes are slurred, you have to articulate them with your valves instead of your tongue. But really, whether you're tonguing or slurring, you've got to make sure that you pound your valves to make your notes speak clearly. Many young players have a tendency to slow down their fingers when they're playing softly or when they're playing slowly. It really doesn't matter what you're playing. Always move your valves as fast and hard as you can. Unless your instrument is broken, no one will hear the valve sound over your playing, no matter how quickly you press down. That brings us to the trill in measure 43. There are many ways to play trills, but the standard way to play a trill in classical music is to start the trill on the next note above in the scale. This is called the upper auxiliary note. There are some occasions when you might want to start on the primary note, but that usually has more to do with what you were playing right before the trill. I'll make sure to point out any of these exceptions as we come across them, but for now, always start your trills on the upper note. Also, except for some specific exceptions, you want to make sure to play the trill evenly throughout. Don't start slow and speed up or vice versa. Find a speed that makes sense and try and play it the same way every time. Listen to this opening phrase one more time with the piano to help get a little feel for how it all fits together. The next several measures emphasize this back and forth with the accompaniment even more. Again, the key is to understand the contrast between when you're playing lyrically and when you're playing fanfares. For example, your entrance in measure 45 is lyrical, but the downbeats on measure 46 are definitely more fanfarish. Give them some rhythmic energy by not playing them quite as long. Don't play pecky, though. The same goes for measure 47, although this entrance is definitely softer. This is the first actual chromatic scale we've seen, which makes it the first chromatic scale that audiences probably ever heard on the trumpet, at least in this range. But you don't want to emphasize this by bringing it out because we're still at the beginning of the movement. The fanfare in measure 49 is important to play in exact and perfect rhythm with the accompaniment. Make sure you listen and have the eighth note pulse locked in your head. Take a deep breath and then play it like you were playing a drum. Listen to this entire section again and try focusing on the rhythms in the piano accompaniment before each trumpet entrance.